Hello everybody and welcome back to the Eureka Centre here in UCC, and the topic of today's presentation, as you can see, is learning outcomes and competences. We're going to look at this word competence and see how exactly is it related to learning outcomes. Now, Stephen Adams, whom I have quoted in some of the previous presentations, is a real expert on the Bologna process. And he pointed out that the relationship between learning outcomes and competences is a complex area indeed. And you may remember when learning outcomes came into being with the focus put on them in 1999 with the Bologna Declaration, a lot of the old type of terminology was used in many programs throughout not only the European higher education area, but throughout the world. And one of these old sort of terms was competences. So let's try to figure out what exactly is meant by the term competences. So the first point, as you can see on the screen there, is that there is considerable confusion in the literature. And when I was preparing this talk, I did quite a bit of a review of literature for a paper I was writing in collaboration with some colleagues. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the literature is absolutely clear that the term competence has various different types of interpretations. And to add to the confusion in the English language, we have the term competence and the term competency. And we'll try to disentangle these two terms in a moment. So what does it mean, this term competence? Well, Winterton points out that it's difficult to find a precise definition for the term. By the way, I'll be quoting from various authors here, and in one of the PDFs that are uploaded by CERTL, you will find a complete list of all the references used in all of the presentations. And he said that really there's such confusion and debate, it's impossible to identify a definition which accommodates or reconciles all the different ways that the term is used. So let me just give you a flavour of some of the different ways in which the term is used. Way back, in the 1990s, the original definition of competence was very much in terms of a narrow interpretation. For example, it was very much in terms of a skill, particularly a manual skill. So skills acquired by training. In the training agency in the UK, competence was looked at involving both skills and knowledge. And they also interpreted in terms of transferring skills and knowledge to new situations. So there was a bit of a movement by others, instead of just looking at the skill aspect of it, to expand it to include knowledge and skills. Other people took a more broader definition. And in the ECTS User's Guide in 2005, competence was defined as a dynamic combination of attributes, abilities, and attitudes. And it goes on then to talk about competences are for various courses divided into subject areas. Now, as you can see, this is a very broad general definition. A dynamic combination of attributes, abilities, and attitudes. I really don't know what that means. It could open to hundreds of different interpretations. The OECD definition of competency is that it involves skills and attitudes. They made no distinction between competence and competency. So they give as an example the ability to communicate effectively as being a competency. So that certainly doesn't help in terms of trying to define the term competence. In nursing, Miller describes two interpretations of the term competence. One in terms of the ability to perform specific nursing tasks, and he gives examples like measuring blood pressure, performing a venipuncture, and so on. However, He also points out that the term competence is also looked at in a much broader term, involving the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor skills. In other words, people see it as a combination of the three domains of Bloom's taxonomy, as we discussed in a previous presentation. When the European Qualifications Framework was published in 2008, you'll see that competence here is quite distinct from knowledge and skills. Knowledge was defined as theoretical or factual. Skills were defined, logical, intuitive, creative thinking, and so on, including manual dexterity. But competence was defined as something in quite a different category. It was described in terms of just responsibility and autonomy. In other words, performance in the workplace. And there was quite a bit of debate about the term competence. And when the European Qualifications Framework was revised in 2018, they got rid of the term competence completely. And they replaced it with words which are commonly well understood, words like responsibility and autonomy. In other words, performance in the workplace. It was still knowledge and skills in separate compartments, and this was all about responsibility and autonomy. So in Ireland, there was a huge amount of confusion created when the National Qualifications Framework of Ireland was published in 2003. You might recall from a previous discussion on the National Qualifications Framework of Ireland, in one of these presentations, I pointed out that Ireland was the first across the line with the National Qualifications Framework. Now, whereas it looked good for Ireland, nevertheless, those countries that waited to see what was going to happen in the European Qualifications Framework were a bit wiser, because in 2003 we used the term competence and various definitions. Now, I won't go into these at all because I find these definitions very confusing myself. And the only place in Ireland that we come across competence is in our National Qualifications Framework, in terms of these very broad, overarching statements. And in one of the previous presentations in this series, I gave some advice about how to interpret keywords in these competences when mapping programme learning outcomes onto the National Qualifications Framework. Then Neary, in a very interesting paper that he wrote, he took again this broad range of knowledge, attitudes, and observable patterns of behaviour. So again, Neary looked on the term competence in a very sort of holistic type setting, that it wasn't just skills, but it brought in knowledge and attitudes. Again, different from the European Qualifications Framework interpretation. Then there was an EU project called the Tuning Project. It's very much outdated now, but unfortunately the pillars of the Tuning Project were built on competences, and they gave lots of examples in the Tuning Project of what they called generic competences, and you can see them there. I won't run through them, but some of them are very general statements, some of them are just one or two words, some of them phrases, some of them sentences. And they had a whole pile of these generic competences which they churned out. And they even issued a questionnaire for academics, trying to rank in order of importance. Now, given 17 generic competences and asking them to rank them in order of importance from 1 to 17 was really an impossible task, especially when they're so vague. And you can see there, some of them are just words like capacity to learn, ethical commitment, interpersonal skills, those sorts of things. Broad, very general statements. So obviously from the list of competences Tuning Project, many of them are of general nature. And if you're not clear about what exactly the competence is, then it's very difficult, it's not possible to measure them. And one of the big problems about competences, of course, is that there are no rules or guidelines available for writing them, simply because no one can agree on what a competence actually is. So they come in a wide variety of confusing terminology. And some people say generic competence are the same as transferable skills. Other people say it's far more than skills, that it also brings in knowledge and understanding. In the English language, as I mentioned earlier, the term competence and competency exist. Some authors say the same, they mean the same. Some authors say they mean things quite different. So there is even more confusion added to the meaning of the terms competence and competency. You know, Woodruff wrote a good paper in which he said competence is an umbrella term. That's anything that's related to job performance. And so we're getting closer to the meaning now of the term competent in the ordinary usage of the English language. So if you say somebody is a competent administrator or a competent lecturer or a competent teacher, you simply mean they can do their job well. So Woodruff talks about this umbrella term as meaning. And one way that one could describe competency in the context of Bloom's taxonomy, in terms of the psychomotor, cognitive and affective, that if you have reached the learning outcomes associated with these three domains, then you can be said to be a competent person. So a teacher, who has the knowledge of the subject, a teacher who has the skills of teaching, and a teacher who has the right attitude when dealing with their students, that teacher will be a competent teacher. And that is about the simplest way one could use the word competent. When doing my research for a paper on the relationship between competence and learning outcomes, I did come across one very good paper. It was the best paper that really shone out. And that was the paper here by Hartel and Foydkin. They were two food engineers, and they defined the competence as a general statement detailing the desired knowledge and skills of students graduating from our course or program. Now, what did they do? They said, okay, this is the competence in one of the programs in food engineering. These are the objectives that they had set related to this competence, and then they wrote the learning outcomes for the competence. Extremely well written, as you can see there. So from this we see that a competence is a very broad general statement, something like what we would have in Ireland in our national qualifications framework. Objectives are more specific to the course that you are teaching, and then the learning outcomes highlight and illuminate what the objectives actually mean when you specify exactly what students must do in order to achieve these learning outcomes. And by achieving these learning outcomes, they achieve a degree of competency in the particular subject. So the learning outcomes therefore illuminate or explain the meaning of the term competence as written by the two authors then. Now, in dentistry and in other professions, competencies are defined very much so in terms of skills. In dentistry, psychomotor skills, like the ability to give an injection, the ability to extract a tooth, the ability to insert a filling in a tooth, and so on. So this was a very good paper by Chambers, and he says competencies, it's a general term. It finds its way to conversations when a general word is needed referring to good dentistry. So again, a very broad term. An excellent paper on this word competence was written by two colleagues from the Netherlands, Van der Klink and Boon. And they refer to as competence a fuzzy concept. And they call it competencies the triumph of a fuzzy concept, because it's a word that's used a lot without anybody bothering to explain what exactly they mean by it. So it's a term sort of bridging the gap between education on one hand and requirements of the job on the other hand. Okay, and they do in their paper says that there are differences across nations, for example. And they talk about in the British report, it means, performance standards, the national vocational qualifications, which is where the word competence was first used, as I mentioned earlier on. It sounds very much in terms of practical skills. In the USA, competencies refer to skills, knowledge, and characteristics like motives, self-concept, performance excellence. And then in the German perspective, it's not just skills and knowledge, but it's integrated action programs and again, performance in the workplace. Notice how this idea of performance in the workplace keeps popping up time and time again. Everything you need to know about learning outcomes and competences is covered in this paper here that was published in the Bologna Handbook, which my colleagues Professor Anya Hyland, Dr. Norma Ryan, and I wrote some years ago. And the references for that are given in the list of references. So, in conclusion, therefore, what could we say? No single definition. A complete range, overarching concepts to specific skills. And there are no guidelines for writing competences, unlike the fact that there are lots of clear rules in the literature for how learning outcomes should be written. And as I mentioned earlier on, competences can be viewed as a result of achieving learning outcomes. So learning outcomes can complement each other without a doubt. But many countries don't use competences at all. In fact, I would say the majority of countries don't use competences. And since Bologna, those who did use competences have changed to learning outcomes, module learning outcomes and program learning outcomes. And Brown, in a very good paper, said that one of the main reasons is that social science have taken a word from our common vocabulary, the word competence or competence or competent, and trying to give it some sort of a technical or scientific or academic meaning that it was never intended. So therefore it has become this fuzzy concept as discussed in the paper that we mentioned earlier. So what would I recommend if you do have to use the word competence in, say, a particular profession that you might be involved in, or in a paper that you're writing? Well then, the first thing to do is that if you are using the word competence, state what definition are you using. Is it the definition of the European Qualifications Framework? Is it the definition from the Bologna Handbook? Or whatever. Okay? And then, if you do have to write competences, and I remember being in Chile, working with several universities on this task, where they had a lot of their programs written in competences, and they wanted to, change them all into learning outcomes. Then if you understand what the competence is saying, you should be able to write it in learning outcomes, and that will help to illuminate what the competence means. So since we don't have a common understanding of what the word competence does mean, what we should really be doing is writing our competences in terms of learning outcomes. And so the fuzziness, as our two friends from the Netherlands, Van der Klink and Boone, mentioned in their paper on describing competences, that fuzziness will disappear once we write learning outcomes. So we're on solid ground when we write learning outcomes. We're on very much shifting sands if we have to write competences. So I hope this short overview has given you food for thought, and that it has got across the main idea to avoid competences using that term if you possibly can at all. Okay? So thank you all very much for your kind attention, and we'll wrap up with that.